There are conversations we avoid, not because they're meaningless, but because they are too meaningful. Death is one of those conversations. And yet, as today's guest so gently and powerfully reminds us, speaking of death is not morbid, it is liberating. My guest is Johanna Lunn, a multi-award-winning filmmaker, producer, and the visionary behind the You Die Project. Through her deeply moving trilogy of films, including In the Realm of Death and Dreaming, Saying Goodbye, and Architecture of Death, she has opened space for a cultural dialogue we desperately need, one that begins at the end but does not end there. In this episode, we speak of what it means to prepare for death, why Swedish death cleaning is not about minimalism but about legacy, and how near-death experiences, deathbed visions, and liminal dreams might not be fantasy, but memory. As someone who lost my father this year, and as someone who lives at the intersection of health span, longevity, and the search for meaning, I feel this conversation in my bones, because what we avoid holds power over us, but what we name, we can walk with. So I invite you now into this sacred conversation, soft, subversive, and filled with grace.
Superhumanize. Accelerated evolution.
Johanna, what a profound pleasure. Thank you for making time for us today, and welcome to the Superhumanized podcast.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, it is really such a delight. And even though that may sound strange to some, considering the topic we're going to talk about, but it is. And for me, as someone who spent years, decades really, immersed in wellness and longevity, I have noticed a striking pattern. While we chase youth and optimization, we often exile death from the conversation. And when my own father passed at 89 years old in March, I just realized how unprepared even someone like me, the quote, wellness literate, can be when it comes to dying well and also to grieving fully. And when I came across your work, Johanna, you have said that the project that you founded, that you initiated, the When You Die Project, was born from a desire to give people something to talk about. And so I would like to lead into this conversation with asking you for your perspective, Johanna, on why do you think talking about death has become such a cultural taboo in our kind of culture, and what opens when we begin to speak of it?
There's a number of different ways that I could answer that. So I'll do a little bit of historical rundown on when the background here is that in my grandmother's generation, they had a family homestead in Pennsylvania. There were 12 kids that were born there. A number of them died at a young age. So babies born, babies dying. And the house itself was actually purpose built. There was a small door in the parlor that I actually, as a young child, thought that's where the wood came into the house for the fireplace. But it wasn't until I was well into my teenage years that I realized there's no fireplace here. So I asked my grandmother, what is that door? And she said, oh, it's where the dead bodies go, feet first. So the house was built knowing that babies would be born and people would die in it. So in her generation, they understood the language of both birthing and dying, which we have completely forgotten. And I think really it was the culmination of World War I, World War II, and then later the Korean War, that there was so much suffering and so much loss and so much death. And people that fought in those wars were trying to fight the last war that would ever be fought so we could live in peace. That's a whole discussion. But Obviously, so at that point, it was a way of we don't want death anymore. We don't want this deep sadness. Let's build a new world. Let's feed the world. Let's have shelter and education and all the things that all of us long for our children and our future. And this is a time when the Ladies' Home Journal, a very popular magazine in North America, really introduced the living room. It had always been called the parlor, but now it's time to take death out of the house, and this is a room for the living. And that coincided with the rise of funeral homes. So you didn't have to, and also healthcare facilities, bigger and more healthcare facilities. So you didn't have to die at home, or if you did, the body would go to the funeral home and, maybe you might have a wake at home, but most likely the idea was that you're going to live now. That's what homes are for. And that was really the seed of the beginning of pushing death out of the cultural conversation in North America. And similar things happened in different countries throughout Europe to differing degrees. But the main thought here was now we're going to live for the future. We're living forward. We're not living backwards. And little by little, it became, as another generation came along, by the end of the second generation, my parents' generation, really the idea of going to even an open coffin funeral was just like, oh, why would you do that? And similarly, around the same time, it was that birthing babies wasn't done at home. That was done in a hospital, and that breastfeeding was somehow primitive. And so we had a real medicalization of the human body starting to happen rather than sovereignty over the human body. Very interesting cultural phenomena, really. So we really lost our thread with it all. And as a result, if you're moving more and more into a materialist culture, you want washing machines and you want more cars and you want all of these things, and that those are the things that will make you happy, and you will be living more fully if you have these things. So as that progressed, death shrunk away, and we no longer really knew how to relate to people who were dying or who were grieving. And this, I would say, in my own life really came to the fore when I was starting at the age of 19, 3 very significant deaths. My mother, my dearest friend who was like a sister to me, and then I was a passenger in a car accident where an old dairy farmer was hit and he died in my arms, and that was less than 3 years. So I was really grieving hard at a time, your late teens, moving into your 20s, when socialization was so important and forming bonds with people, and no one could talk to me. They did not know how to relate to me. And I'm just one example of this thing happening over and over and over again, of where you're grieving and you become a social outcast. You're isolated. And it's a terrible experience. And we didn't have grief counselors, and we didn't have ways of talking about these things that could allow for the integration of these experiences. That's a long way of saying we lost it. We just lost our relationship. And so as a result, all kinds of trauma happens. When someone is dying a natural death, oftentimes it's interpreted that what their body is doing as they're shutting down is suffering and harmful and painful. And so the loved one ends up being traumatized by having experienced death, when if you understood the language of death, how we die, then, oh, that's just normal.
And this is where your work comes in and connects what has been ripped apart by silence. What you shared about how it started in recent times, so in the last century, with regard to death being pushed out of the homes. That is so fascinating, Johanna. And yes, the living room. I didn't even know about that. This is so interesting. And I wonder if we already, prior to these culturally traumatic events, all these wars, were just not prepared to handle death, whether it was on a smaller or a larger level. And then also what you said is so important, that death goes hand in hand with grief, and what you shared about losing your loved ones and how that must have cracked your world open in your youth, and that the silence around the grief, that can be almost as painful as the loss itself. And so I'm really curious. I'd like to learn more before we go into your work, and also into death itself and how dying looks like when it's a natural death. But first, I'd like to learn a little bit more, Johanna, about how has your personal grief shaped the lens through which you now create stories, create film, how you lead conversations around death. And also, do you feel that grief is a form of storytelling?
Oh, I love that question. Grief, there is a lot of energy in grief, and many things have come out of grief. Foundations, many nonprofit organizations, new businesses, novels, plays, music, artwork. There's just a tremendous amount of outpouring that came from the well of grief, from the tender, broken heart. And it's actually an extraordinary time, that I think that if we could really learn more about grieving itself and how to have healthy grieving, which is really what my whole project is all about, then we could be more supportive of this phase of life, because everybody experiences grief, and it doesn't have to be just because of death. We lose jobs, which could be our whole identity. When people are laid off, it's just like they've been killed. Part of their whole personality has been killed. So there's those kinds of smaller deaths, loss of job, loss of a marriage or a relationship. You could even grieve over something that you really loved, your grandmother's ring, and you lost it. So there's all grief is not a stranger to us. Just the way we didn't know how to label it. We didn't recognize that as a human emotion. It was almost like some object. Oh, that's grief over there, when actually it's something that is part of our own inner cosmology. Anyway, so for myself, it was that grief journey ultimately that led me to creating the When You Die Project. For me, coming out of that difficult time in my 20s, going through university and graduating, and one of my first jobs was being a researcher on a potential project for PBS on death and dying. And so I was hired to go and talk to some of the early hospice creators. We didn't have hospice, but during the AIDS epidemic, it's kind of like when hospice came into effect. And these are people that were there at the front line of the HIV/AIDS crisis. And because those people were not allowed in hospitals, and they were real outcasts in a sense. So things like the Zen Center in San Francisco was a really big player. And also the Zen Center in New York was a big player. And people like Kubler-Ross, Dr. Kubler-Ross, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, was really also right there, trying to bring the message of death as something that is part of life forward. So I got to talk to a lot of these really amazing people. And I then also spent time at the bedside of people who were dying as part of my research. And I had a really pivotal, I would say it was a game changer for me, moment when I was sitting, and it was the first person who I had ever sat with who died. And this was in Colorado, up in the mountains. And there was a care facility up there, and there was a woman who was in her early 90s dying, and she didn't have any family. There was no one. She had no one. And the head nurse said, "You can come and sit with Betsy. It'll be good for you." And she was pretty much unconscious, sleeping, breathing fairly heavily, and then stopping and breathing. And the room was dark. The shades were pulled. There was nothing personal in the room. It was just an institutional room with a hospital bed. There was no personality there. And this frail, emaciated woman who was dying. And I sat next to her, and I just put the back of my hand next to the back of her arm, so she had some human contact. And at some point, she said in a really thin voice, "I feel as if I am floating in a sea of love." I am held by a net of love. I was like, wow, she's not alone. She was not alone. And that shifted my own grief 100%. Maybe not 100%, but it was a big change. And then as I kept learning more and more about death as a young woman, it was the only antidote to the trauma that I had experienced, was learning about what happens when you die.
And the trauma comes from not having been in a loving and way that integrates this rite of passage that we all have to go through. It comes from just not knowing, not having been taught. That's also why, as a writer and also a former journalist, I so deeply believe in the power of stories to shift paradigms, to shift this cultural paradigm where we have forgotten how to die. And your trilogy of films does just that. It opens a really tender portal into something we often fear. And it also does so through the language of story. And I really think that storytelling plays a huge role in building, if you can call it death literacy. And that I also think, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. Do you think that a well-told story can prepare us better than any medical manual ever could?
Oh, yes, I do. I think we remember stories, whereas medical manuals, not so much.
Yeah. And there is actually a part of your film that struck me. It was, let me see if I paraphrase this correctly. What is a conscious death? Could we have one? And living in Los Angeles, being surrounded by the longevity world, I'm actually sitting here in our longevity clinic right now that I'm using as my office, Gateway Clinics on Montana Avenue. So being literally surrounded by the longevity world also right now, I've often wondered if we sometimes chase vitality to avoid that deeper inquiry. What does it mean to die consciously? And so, Johanna, I'd like to know, what have you learned through your interviews, your films, about the qualities of a conscious death? Are there certain through lines that appear no matter what a person's background or beliefs may be? What is a conscious death?
The interesting thing about a conscious death is that it's not one thing, because a conscious death could be someone who has done the good Swedish death cleaning and gotten rid of all of the stuff in their house, and they've done their wills and they've done their medical directives and they've talked to their family about what they want and really lined up all of those things that can be such a burden to your loved ones. If you just go and your house is just full of stuff and you have no will and all, it's a nightmare. It is a nightmare for people. So that is part of a conscious death, or it could be a conscious death, to take care of all your material things and also to have that deep introspection about, what do I want when I die? One woman wanted to have a flash dance at her funeral. So they're in a Presbyterian church, very kind of New England. Everyone's sad and dressed in black. And in the middle of the minister's eulogy, people pop up and they sing, "Another one bites the dust."
I love
So you
it.
could have fun with this conversation of, what do I want? And people started laughing and they thought, isn't that just her? It's just like her. So those things could be a conscious death, or there could be the kind of conscious death of one who has also had a lot of introspection about their life and they've made meaning from their life and they've come to peace with where they are at this time of their life. And they've said the things that they want to say to other people. And then really they just can turn inward and release. And that's a magical thing. And I don't think it's a bar that we should set for everyone by any stretch. But there are people that really can say, okay, this is my time. I'm done. I'm ready. And just in a natural way, allow yourself to let go in the most inner biological way to cut that thread that holds our consciousness.
So what I'm hearing here, Johanna, is that conscious death is very deeply interwoven with being present with the self, being present with the process, with death. And what you just shared about the woman who had the flash dance, that is just so beautiful and heartwarming. It puts tears in my eyes and a big smile on my face at the same time. So there are certain things, it's deeply personal, of course. And there are certain things, what you mentioned about the Swedish death cleaning. I actually came across that post on your website about this. I think it's called deadening. It's such an evocative practice. It's not just about tidying up, but it's about making space and lessening the burden for those we leave behind. And in a way, also facing death not as something fearsome, unknown, but that it's part of life's choreography. And I found that so deeply moving. And it made me reflect on the things I may one day, maybe not just one day, because, hey, I could walk out on the street and get hit by a truck tomorrow. So hopefully not. But what do I want to pass on intentionally? And not just objects, but memories, meanings, or even recipes. And what are your thoughts on this particular practice? Because it's really struck a chord with me. Do you think that Swedish death cleaning is also a doorway for a more conscious relationship with death? And can practices like this help us perhaps initiate loving conversations and gentle preparations long before we're at that actual threshold?
I do. And I don't think that it's just for that end of life experience. I think it's for life itself. I've certainly heard it said, and I do believe it's true, that the more we clean up our mental chatter and our physical attachments to things, clean out your house, clean out your car, the more you are making space for something new to happen. And I think this is a really important thing in a very materialistic world that we live in. We could let go of probably 75% of the stuff in your house. And if you've ever gone on a vacation, an extended vacation with one suitcase and been gone for weeks, you realize you only needed what was in your suitcase. And that because you weren't having to bring your whole house load of stuff along, that you were more able to spend time living than taking care of all the stuff. Now, I'm not saying that I live in a Zen house. I don't. But I do believe that just like the idea of taking inventory and stock of your life, your material possessions, but also your experiences, so that you can say, I'm at peace with this, is good, or that kind of fearless reflection of your day and say, I could have done that better. And then, so you've had a little way of that daily practice of clearing out, so that when you come to the end of your life, and hopefully we will not die in a car accident, but actually be able to have the time to say goodbye, we can do that and we know what we need to say, or a lot of it's already been said. That's one way of looking at it there, that really death cleaning is opening to life.
And my lovely, wonderful mother-in-law, she is 88 years old now, and she already a few years ago initiated the conversation, asking everybody in the family to let her know what we would want of hers. And she wants to put little colored, tiny little stickers on the back of everything. And I thought that was wonderful. But some people in the family are actually quite upset at it, where I think, especially the more I learn talking to individuals like you, this is actually a practice, something to be honored, because this is also the individual, and hopefully she lives another, she's so vital, 20 years healthily and fully at least. But I respect that. I honor that. And I think the being upset is also rooted not only, no, I don't want to lose this loved person, but bringing up death, the possibility of it at all, which again brings us back to this core wound. We've forgotten how to die. And something else that has struck me in conversations with end of life workers, I recently spoke to Barbara Carnes, and even stories of friends, I've heard about deathbed visions, visits, messages, or these moments of clarity just before death. And I feel like we don't give enough reverence to these moments. And I'd like to learn from you, Johanna, what stood out to you most when documenting stories of near-death experiences or deathbed visions?
Oh, yeah. I think that it increased my appreciation of the ineffable, that that great web, like that when I was referring to the first death I ever sat with, that woman saying that she felt as if she was suspended by a field of love. That is an ineffable, transcendent experience. And NDEs and shared death experiences and all kinds of transformative, spiritually transformative experiences that can happen, distance communication with a loved one. There are many things that can happen in the final days and hours of a person's life that could include a loved one's spirit coming to you in a dream or in your waking state and saying, I'm going to be okay. Usually it's a message of don't worry, to help them not freak out when they die. And it's more common than we would like to believe. Often you go, oh no, I'm going to push it away. And it's also a thing of, if you're dreaming, you might have one interpretation. And if you're awake, you might have a different relationship to it. But if we could open ourselves to some of these transcendent experiences that happen, the world becomes a much more vivid place. And I guess this is, again, the marriage of death and life. They are inseparable things, and they have a lot to teach each other. So I was really, especially talking to people with NDEs, because I really started there with that question. I wanted to make films that weren't just about the physical aspect of dying, but also the emotional and the spiritual aspect of dying, because we really focus on the physical so much. But these other dimensions are the things that really give the breadth of what the dying experience is about. So talking to people who have had near-death experiences, and usually I did try to focus on people who had died in a clinical setting. So there is a record. Evidence-based stories are really a way of bringing credence to some of these experiences. So we can say, this happened in a hospital. This is what their vital signs were like. And then their heart stopped and their brain stopped. And then we were able to resuscitate them. And then what happened in the time when they were clinically dead. So these near-death experiences are really fascinating to me, because you can, on the one hand, say we have recorded it in a clinical setting, but then on the other hand, you learn that people have had extraordinary experiences. Usually it's an out-of-body experience where you can often look back on the room that you're in and you can see people working on your body and even describe later what was happening to you, but you are known to be dead, so how could you possibly know that? So those kinds of stories are very helpful. But then travel beyond to, sometimes it's called another room, or you might go down a tunnel, or you enter a different space that is a really loving, truly loving and benevolent place. And you could receive all kinds of information, and you could just be bathed in no longer suffering. You're experiencing a love you have never had in your entire life, and many other extraordinary experiences. And I loved hearing about these stories. And when people told them to me, it was indeed realer than real. Even if this story happened to them 15 years ago, they were telling it like it happened yesterday. And these are not hallucinations, because most hallucinations are fearful, like ants crawling on the walls or things that are frightening, and they don't have any kind of steady cognitive mental experience. They're just all over the place. And when you're given a drug, then they go away. But NDEs are not like that at all. You can have a frightening NDE, but even those are vivid and have a quality to them that is realer than real. So people remember them 20 years later. It happened yesterday. And so in the telling, it's almost like getting a contact high of some type, because it was the more I was surrounding myself with people and their different stories, it elevated me in a way that I can't really even fully explain. But it was life-giving to hear these stories.
That's amazing, Johanna. And I have only ever talked to one person who had an experience like this. He was actually also a guest on this podcast, Eben Alexander. He wrote a very interesting book about his experience, and it gives a lot of hope. I have not had in my private field anyone who had something like that occur, but just hearing about it gives a sense of peace. And I also noticed that you spoke to also a lot of experts, and I noticed that one of the featured individuals in the When You Die films is Dr. Dean Radin, who I also had the pleasure of interviewing on this podcast. And his work always lingers with me, especially his exploration of how consciousness may not be bound to the brain alone. And it was beautiful to see him woven into this conversation. In your experience, and even if it's not, let's say, quantifiable in a scientific or medical sense, but what do these phenomena reveal about the nature of consciousness or what may lie beyond? What is your own perception of this?
I definitely think that if you want to study consciousness, that end of life experiences is a really important area to be in, because the stories are quantifiable and they're extraordinary. And we actually have a huge body of literature now that goes back, oh golly, I'd say NDEs have been recorded for hundreds, probably 1,000 years, but in actual real clinical studies, 50 years worth of really excellent work. And I would definitely give a shout out to the DOPS, Department of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia, and Kenneth Ring in particular, and then also the IANS Institute, International Studies of Near-Death Experiences, because they have been a repository of a lot of research around all of these experiences. And then people like Dean Radin and the work that was done at Duke University back in the 50s and 60s. And there's a lot of work on these psi things. I think that if we really drop our cynicism and really listen to these stories and just try it on, just say, what does it feel like to think that you could travel in your dreams and have experiences that were every bit as enriching as your daily life, maybe more enriching? Or why not have your Aunt Jenny come and visit you when she's died and tell you, I'm okay? I had that experience when I was around 9 years old. I knew when my great aunt had died, and nobody told me. No one told me. And it was like, how did that happen? It's amazing. And that's a really common thing, very common thing. Or synchronicities that happen after someone has died, which I always find those stories really interesting. Like people will say, for a whole year, these birds came and visited me. Even when they were out of season, they shouldn't have been there. And I felt like it was their presence. So both on the feeling level as well as on the good scholarly level, there's a lot there to really say, this is part of the human experience. It's not just a sidebar for slumber parties and Ouija boards.
Yes, and thank you for pointing out the actual vast research that has been done. And I'm very curious. I will look into these organizations that you mentioned. And I want to share something personal. Literally within hours before my father passed in Germany, I live here in Los Angeles mainly. I had, because you mentioned the birds, and I've always had a kind of a nice little relationship with crows. And I was at the clinic, and it was so unusual. Even a nurse who was working here at the time pointed it, I shared it with her, and she was astounded. There was a crow that very purposefully walked up to the glass door, never happened before in all the years this place has been open, stood there, looked at me. It had to turn its head to look at me because I was behind the counter, just looked at me, and then it popped off and flew off. And I just knew, I knew my father is going to pass. He'd been struggling for a while. I very much believe in this. And what you shared about the passing of your loved one, and you knew even though nobody told you about it. It's so interesting how often our families try to keep us from things, but actually keeping the conversations and what actually happens from us can be deeply painful to us. And you shared a beautiful story about making beef bourguignon to invite your father's memory to dinner. And that imagery was so vivid. And it reminds me that remembrance can be an act of continued relationship and not closure. And I wonder what happens when we create space for those conversations before death too. How can families begin these conversations across generations? And what have you seen that helps shift this energy of fear to intimacy when talking with parents, children, or elders about dying?
I do think that our fear fundamentally is our fear of the unknown. And so as people understand more of what can happen when you die, and these kinds of phenomena that can happen around death, it relaxes people around having the conversation. And there's so much to be curious about. And I think that the whole conversation about consciousness, what do you think happens when you die? Does consciousness continue or not? And I think that is a safe conversation because we all watch science fiction. We've all had thoughts like, could AI become conscious? And there's a whole bunch of stuff out there. So that's a safe conversation to say, what do you think? And if you can break through the barrier of, I shouldn't say what I really think because it's really out there and they'll think I'm crazy. If you can get past that barrier, then you can have a really fun conversation. And so I really think that, this kind of naturalizing death is one conversation at a time. I know some people are like, we could legislate something, we could get government. And no, I really don't think it's like that at all. I think it's like, we are having more conversations about grief than we have ever had before. This is so important. I know people who are working hard to introduce policies in workplaces for people who are grieving so that they don't go 3 days. Your mother died. We'll see you back in 3 days. That's crazy. But that is probably the majority of the world right now. So I think it's all of these things together, but it's conversations that will really change it. And I think that it doesn't have to be heavy.
No.
It doesn't have to be, which is why I love the story of the flash mob at a funeral, because it could be that. You really could do that.
Yes. It's your death. You can do whatever you want, whatever the heavens you want.
That's right.
Oh. In your third film, this is something I was really curious about. It's titled The Architecture of Death. And that phrase haunts me in the best way because it suggests that death has its own shape, structure, and even beauty. And I feel we often forget that. If you want to name it, the designs of it. And when you look at death as architecture, Johanna, what are some of its rooms, its foundations, or secret passageways? What have you come to understand about the inner world of dying?
I think we're really talking about the final months and weeks and days and moments leading up to death and a couple of days after when we talk about the architecture of death. And as Barbara Carnes has spoken a lot about the physical aspects of dying, and boy, I have to tell you, she is one of my favorite people on the planet. She is such a special human being. She's done so much to generate conversation in hospitals with families through her pamphlets, which is really important. Sometimes it's the only piece of information a human has ever gotten in their life about dying. So we do know that when we're dying of disease, most important thing to keep in mind is that death isn't painful. Disease is painful. So getting good pain management care is really critical because it is the number one thing that people are afraid of is
Right.
being in pain. So we can control that. We just need to bring the right team in to work with pain management. And then really understand that when your loved one is sleeping a lot, that's okay. That's their body now going inward, needing to sleep. And their interest in food might have gone away altogether. And their interest in fluid, drinking water, and wanting to just not, their waking hours are less and less. And as you get closer to death, the body has been busy doing two things. Physically, it's shutting down, but it's also, and this is wild, it's healing. Your fingernails are still growing, and there's a lot of healing, physical healing things that are going on in the body, but it's not fighting at all against the dying aspects. But the body's this really extraordinary. I don't think we really love our bodies the way we should. We're amazing. Just the sheer number of things that are taking place just in the course of the 1 minute with you and I conversing that are happening, both in our individual bodies and then a back and forth communication that we're not even aware of. So the body is both healing in a certain way and it's starting to shut down. And when the body starts to shut down and it's not taking on fluids, so this is where IVs for fluid or forcing people to eat is a terrible idea because it causes pain. That causes suffering. We don't want to go there. But instead, recognize that as the body is shutting down, it is also manufacturing more endorphins to help deal with pain. We still can help that process because, again, disease is the thing that is causing pain, but also the body is there. So we want to do things that encourage the body to be producing these endorphins that are working on the pain. So we have to really learn about the biological process so we know better what are we blocking, because oftentimes we are blocking the body's ability to die. So we don't want to do that. And then as you're really turning into the final days, maybe 3 days or so, you'll have breathing, changes in breathing that can be very shocking. I know with my father-in-law, he had such intense chain stroke breathing that his entire body was like almost jumping off the bed in these big gulping for breath and then nothing. And you'd think, is he dead? And then it would be very scary. This is very scary. This is one of the things that traumatize people over and over again. And I've had many people come up to me after my films and say, I thought they were torturing my father. And now I know he was just dying a normal death. And I think, why couldn't someone have told that person that it was normal right then, or even before we entered that stage? So that's a big piece that can happen. Also, there's terminal lucidity that can happen. And this is when someone is in a coma and has been for some time, and suddenly they're fully present. Their eyes open, they're looking right at you, and they're saying, I love you, or whatever, just some very clear, lucid moment. And of course, when that happens, you want to say, I love you too. That's not possible. So terminal lucidity can happen. And so I'm going to back up. I was down to 3 days, but leading up to this, you're sleeping a lot and you could have deathbed visitations. So on that spiritual level, again, your loved one could have been in a coma for a long time, but suddenly they're sitting up and they're conversing with someone, clearly conversing with someone. And this has been witnessed millions and millions of times. And no one else can see who they're talking to, but they're having a real conversation that is clearly bringing them some comfort, bringing them some joy. So these deathbed visitations, often people who work at end of life, they call them the pickup team. They've seen it so many times. It's, the pickup team is here. They're talking to Joe. They're going to tell him, we're going to come back and get you. And then the language of the dying person changes. When I go home or I need to pack my bag, I'm catching a train, it's all traveling language. So that's very interesting too, is that for the person who's dying, their time spent with us in this outer world has shifted to an inner world that is so much more interesting than us. That can be hard too for family in the sense that you're not as interesting anymore. But it's okay. It doesn't mean they don't love you. It's just they're doing the work because they're leaving. And whether death is the end or not, this is part of their process. And I do want to always say that if people believe that consciousness doesn't continue, it's okay. We should definitely validate everyone's experience. So especially for the people who are having these deathbed visitations, validating them is really critical to a peaceful death. You don't want to argue and say, but Dad, Joe's dead. There's no way you could be talking to him. No, more interesting question. What did he say? So these kinds of experiences can be happening. And also this can be the time when someone is in a coma where these kinds of communications with loved ones that are at a distance, so distance communication can happen, and that's received directly or as a knowing or a feeling. So those things are happening. And oh gosh, there's so many things. So then let's go ahead with how the body is shutting down. No more liquids, no more foods, and the breathing patterns change. And eventually that even stops and they die. But that is not the end of the experiences in the room. There are reports of people seeing shapes coming from the body, ghostly like shapes. The room becomes more sparkly or even a color. There's a smell that's a pleasing smell in the space where quite death is messy and it smells, right? So to then suddenly smell a rose, whoa, wait a minute, because it didn't smell so great. So there's a lot of these types of experiences that can happen in the room itself. Some people hear music, some people hear all kinds of things. And those are clearly experienced by the living, not the dying. And that's also interesting. So that's really just a thimble of the many things that can happen at end of life body. Oh, I should say too, it's really important that as someone is dying, and as their disease is progressing, that the relationship with the living does change. So it does, like I said, you're not as interesting as their inner world. But while that is true, then family members are also, their relationship with one another is changing. And this is really important to know as well. I know that Dr. Chasson, who I interviewed, talked about it like, oh, now we're back like when we were as kids and we're taking on those kinds of roles. You're a grown adult, but you're acting like a child and you're reconstellating your relationships with one another. And because what's happening to each of us when we love, actually they become part of us. And so that part of us is dying. And this, you have to love on yourself a lot here because you have to honor the fact that part of you, it's not always just other, but it's part of you that is dying. And so it will help with families, especially in fraught situations where everyone wants to get lost in the who's getting what and wills and all of this crazy stuff, because that's pretty tragic. That's pretty tragic. So our relationships are going to change with our siblings and other loved ones because each one of us is dying. A piece of them is dying. So we're going through our own death experience as well.
Thank you, Johanna, for illuminating all of that. This is also fundamental. And from the physical, where most people would be like I remember my mother or me even earlier, but to ask my dad, please drink some more, please eat something. And it's well meant, but because we don't know, we do things that are actually not in coherence with what is happening. And I think it's so important. You also mentioned that a part of us also is dying as the loved one dies. And I don't know many people that are aware of this. I was not until you just said it. And we are in a cultural moment where death has very much come to the surface through pandemics, wars, and even climate anxiety. And I feel like death is trying to teach us something. And if death had a message for us right now, Johanna, as a culture, what do you think it would say? What would it be?
Let go.
Ha.
Whatever it is that we're really clinging hard on, let go. Just be, and something totally different will arise. But we've got to break the cycle of fight and flight.
Yes. Johanna, thank you for this truly beautiful conversation, also laced with laughter. And thank you for all the incredible work you're pouring into the world. It's clearly a calling for people who'd like to connect with you or learn more about what it is that you do. How can they do so?
They can reach us through our website, which is whenyoudie.org. And not too hard to remember, I hope, whenyoudie.org. And also on our social media, we're on Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, X for a little while. Oh, and LinkedIn, of course. And Facebook and YouTube. Oh, I meant, yeah. So we're on all of the socials.
Excellent. And we'll make sure to include those in the show notes. And to our audience, thank you for joining us in this conversation with Johanna Lunn. And if you're still here listening, then something in you recognizes the quiet truth we explored together, that death is not the opposite of life, but part of its integrity. And that to speak of dying is to speak of living more honestly. And Johanna's work reminds us that we're all architects of meaning, and that the most sacred structures we build might not be visible. They're choices we make in moments of tenderness, the conversations we may dare to have, the space we hold at the bedside, the clarity we offer those we love. And if you feel called, I invite you to visit whenyoudie.org and explore all of the resources, films, and the stories Johanna has curated so lovingly. And perhaps when the time feels right, you might initiate a conversation of your own over dinner, in the garden, and not because it's urgent, but because it's true. Thank you for being here and for walking this brave edge of becoming with us. Until next time, stay curious, stay open, stay sovereign, and remember, death too is sacred.
Superhumanize. Accelerated evolution.